Sometimes you just need to take the slips out and bowl defensively. And you also need to be careful with your computer's defense as well. If you need a VPN, go Nord. NordVPN.com/Kimber to get a 2-year contract with a discount, plus 4 extra months and gifts in some markets. It's completely risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. The link is in the show notes. So put in some dot balls and turn them into maidens via NordVPN.com/Kimber. Name a job title, please.
Matt Roller, ESPN Cricinfo Assistant Editor.
The only thing I think you got wrong in your article, that's not the only thing I think you got wrong in your article. I think it's a really good article, but the 4 teams per player for on any player in a national domestic contract, I wonder if that isn't restraint of trade in modern cricket. Did you have any blowback from anyone on the player agent or what do you call it? The other thing, the union side of things on that one?
I would say overall I had surprisingly little blowback. I expected to get a bit more from, obviously doing the job, you speak to a fair few people in terms of administrators and agents, and I thought I would get a little bit more than I did. When I was speaking to Fika, so Tom Moffat there, who I think you've had on quite recently, his point, which I get, was that the problem is a scheduling one rather than one that can be solved by regulation. And I think that's fundamentally right. And I think that is the ideal outcome would be that cricket schedules would change significantly and that we wouldn't have got to the point where we have. But it feels like I personally feel as though regulation is the only thing that's going to change any of this within the next 3 years, because the FTP is built in. Leagues have signed multi-year broadcast contracts and are pretty much locked in as well. And I feel like if this problem is allowed to grow in the next 3 years, then nothing is going to change. And, we'll just get to a point where this is even worse. So I think the reason that I propose certain solutions rather than just saying this is a problem was that I feel as though that, cricket generally needs to have this conversation, and administrators need to come up with some kind of way of helping this. I think the problem with all of the regulatory related solutions is that they can be challenged. Obviously that is the mechanism to challenge that will be different in different countries. There's, in countries where there's a strong players union, and they feel as though they have a good understanding of the legal system and can afford expensive lawyers, and that's obviously going to be different to some other countries. But I suppose the counter to that could be that for example, cricket is basically the only sport where a lot of players play for a lot of domestic teams at one time. If Harry Kane decided that he wanted to play MLS for 2 months in the summer, Tottenham would say no. Bayern Munich would say no, and he wouldn't take that to court, and that wouldn't be challenged because they have exclusivity on him. I think with central contracts it would potentially be doable, and I know the PCB have tried it in the past few years with mixed success. I think it would be an interesting scenario to arise, at least where that was getting proposed, but I don't think it's getting talked about.
So the regulation thing's interesting. So I tweeted out this week that the biggest problem was that no one's running any of this. And that's why we're having all these different problems. And, I did another podcast with Srinath where we talked about how all these leagues are now at the same time. And that's causing a lot of the other issues that we have here. And someone was saying, you guys, you always want regulations on free markets. And I was like, yeah, but this free market system isn't working. And I don't know if you read Neil Manthorpe's piece, but he was saying that it reminded him of when journalists learnt about the boom of the internet during the dot-com bubble. And I was like, oh, great. And they all charged an absolute fortune. And of course, all the money disappeared. The issue isn't really, you and I are both franchise fans, and we know the great things that it can bring to the sport. I've worked in franchises. You cover them. A lot of your career is covering this sort of stuff. But we also know from having talked to the people in here what a shit show it is. I mean, your article is not so much about some of the other stuff, but non-player payments, deferred player payments, no medicals for some of these players, insurance issues, all these sorts of things that we go about. And, the thing that I said in my tweet about your piece was that when I first got into it, I was told, oh yeah, if we lose a couple of games here, everyone's just going to shut up shop because they won't see a chance of them getting the winner's check, and so they'd rather go off early than spend another couple of weeks hanging around. The issue here is that you have players who are more than happy to take the money, and we support that, but they are also more than happy if their team doesn't do particularly well, right? Because then that means they'll go off and play in another league. And I won't drop any names here, but after your article came out, it stirred up a lot of these conversations. And there was a fairly big name player who their team of recent times, it might have been in the SA20, I can't remember which league it was now, but their team saw that when they started to lose, they just saw him check out, right? Because he wasn't being a dick or anything, but he was like, well, I've now got to go in this other league, so I'm not going to do extra training. I'm not going to do everything else. We're already probably not going to make it anyway. So I'll just make sure that I get my paycheck here, and then I'll leave. The first minute it is fine, it is available for me to leave, I will leave this tournament.
Yeah, and I think this is the massive problem with these overlapping leagues, and was probably the thing that prompted me to write this piece, was that I fear that whether or not players are actively doing it, it's just a thing that is stuck in the back of players' minds. And I think that's a really unhealthy situation for the sport to be in. Anecdotally, I was hearing stories about players in SA20 who were sort of quite closely, they were probably the single biggest fans of the ILT20 because they were tracking the scores so closely because they had offers from two different teams, and then they were going to take the one that aligned best to their schedule and gave them the best chance of playing multiple knockout games and all that sort of thing. So I don't know. I feel as though it fundamentally got to a point in the last literally the last 3 weeks, and this did happen as well last year, but I feel as though it's gone to a new level this year, where you've had players who it has suited their economic interest. The sort of economically rational cricketer wants to perform to a standard where they're still getting picked and still going to get the odd novelty size check for most sixes in the match or whatever it is, but they're also going to hope that their team doesn't qualify, because that means that they can use that week between the end of one tournament and the start of another to fill their time with an extra week at one of the other ones, because there is a constant, there's a treadmill at the moment particularly for English and West Indian out of season players, because they have that expansive time for the most part.
It feels like every other cricketer in the world is in season during this
period. Yeah. But particularly for those English guys, you can play Abu Dhabi T10, Big Bash, ILT20, BPL, SA20, PSL, IPL. That's 7 leagues just rattled off pretty much back to back from November to end of March, I suppose. And you could theoretically do all of them, and some players are doing 4 or 5 of them, and it doesn't make sense. And I think the other thing that I feel needs to be addressed a bit is that there's a lot of criticism of franchise cricket from people who inherently don't like franchise cricket and think Test cricket is the only good thing. They hate T20, and they hate that the primacy of international cricket has been eroded in their view. And that's fair enough. People are entitled to their opinion. I disagree with it. I think T20 has generally been great for the sport. I love T20, and I think it's there's in a lot of ways it's made the sport more of a meritocracy. Rashid Khan can exist and become one of the biggest players in the sport in a way that wasn't possible 40 years ago. But the problem is that at the moment the model doesn't work for Test cricket fans, and it also doesn't work for franchise fans or T20 fans. Because if you're a 15-year-old in Dubai who's grown up watching the IPL, you think, great, we're getting our own competition here. I'm going to support the Dubai Capitals. Fantastic. I can't wait to follow this team this year. I think they've had over 25 players or something like that across 12 games in the season. They sign all these players at 2 days' notice. Sometimes they bother to put out a post on Instagram or Twitter and say, oh, by the way, we've got this guy. And they're just cycling through. The team that they had towards the end of the comp, I think they had Banton and Deploy opening the batting, both of whom had come straight from SA20. And they had Tom Abel batting 3, who was man of the match in the SA20 final. So how is that suiting the teenage guy who loves franchise T20 cricket in Dubai? It's not at all. So it's not. In my view, it's not working for anyone. It's not just that it's not working for traditional fans of the sport. It's not working for modern fans either, and that's why I think something has to be done.
It's basically only working for betting markets at the moment, isn't it? Like, I mean, it's, and maybe the companies who do social media for different teams across the, because it just doesn't make any sense. Like, as you said, like if you're a fan, like if you're a fan of a Premier League football team, or a rugby team, more or less who's going to play in the next game. You might be frustrated by it, but like there's no idea. And you remember this because I think it came out after your article. There was a photo of one of the players who was wearing a bandana.
It was deployed.
It was deployed. Yeah. I thought it was when you said his name, but I couldn't remember if it was deployed. And you're just looking at it going, that's club cricket. How have we gone? We've gone backwards. Like I remember in the 90s when guys would go out with like county stuff on in international games, and it shamed the international teams. But I mean, the truth is, this is where I come back to it from the more global perspective of what you said before is bilateral cricket is being just torn to shreds, right?
Yeah.
And at the exact same time, the T20 cricket isn't actually being run in a way that will take over from bilateral cricket. They're both just kind of butting into each other. I want to talk about the owners and leagues a little bit here, because when I talked to Neil Manthorpe about this, that was the thing that you and I both know, and we at times, you a lot, and me maybe slightly less. I have to know who roughly he's going to be in the squad or in the team. I usually work it out with the toss, but sometimes I like to know before the toss. At the moment, one of the things that the leagues really like is that ability to say that they have signed a new player, because it means that there will be a Crick Info and a Crick Buzz article, and they'll be able to put it out on Instagram. And who was the player that did the thing a couple of years ago where he was, I think he got picked in the IPL and he did like a video with himself at the airport on the way to the ground. That was, I can't remember who it was with Dealt With Cricket or one of the other TikTokers or whatever. Like those things, I know it sounds stupid, right? But that's a really important thing if you own a franchise, right? And, when I was with St. Lucia and we were losing, like the owner just said to me, tell me who's the biggest name player we can afford to bring in for 2 games, right? Because he was like, we have to get some buzz. If we're not playing very good cricket, we might as well, can we just ship in a famous person so we can say that we're trying to do something here? Owners and leagues really like all that sort of stuff, right? And so it does actually make sense to be able to do that, but it means that it's not really a sport. It's almost more like, I don't know, who's going to support Taylor Swift, or who's going to do a duet with Drake the next time he's performing. It's not really a team sport. And if, as you said, these people who do take it seriously, and there are a lot of T20 fans out there who really take this stuff seriously, that people are taking the piss out of them just so that they can get a really good Insta post, for the Dubai Capitals.
Yeah.
Is that a team?
It is a team. Yeah.
Yes.
They were runners up this year.
A great team. One of my favorites of the year.
They're definitely in my top 6 ILT20 teams. But yeah, you're completely right. I think it's interesting in Premier League football at the moment. We have a situation with the Chelsea owner Todd Bowley, who owns a few. I think he owns I think he's just had a stake in the Lakers and the Dodgers as well. But since he's joined Chelsea, they basically played. He's run Chelsea as though he's running Chelsea on Football Manager or on a FIFA career mode or something like that. And they've constantly signed players every window. They've just thrown money at it and done it in this way where, by spreading the cost of a player across a 10-year accounting period, they can kind of cheat the system on financial fair play. And predictably, it's not worked very well. Chelsea are in mid-table, but they're constantly signing players and constantly linked with another player because that's kind of his way of doing things. And, we've seen just how badly it's gone. The problem with a lot of franchises that are operating outside of the IPL at the moment and outside of the sort of, I suppose, slightly more established leagues, so PSL and Big Bash, those to an extent, but particularly the new ones, I think, is that you have an entire league of top bowlers. Every franchise is run by someone who's seeing it through that means of how can I get someone to write about my team? My team aren't going to win tonight, but if so and so does something interesting and repost it on their own Instagram and they have millions of followers, then that's better than them not doing that. If we're going to lose or if we're going to win anyway, who cares about the result? And yeah, I fear that that again just is not at all working for T20 franchise fans. And I suppose that one of the things that has been pushed back against a lot, I think, within traditional cricket media and administrators as well. It's the idea of an IPL season lengthening and getting longer and taking up a bigger window. But what we have at the moment is arguably a lot worse and a lot more damaging for the sport than if ILT20 didn't exist and we had a 3-month IPL. The sport would fundamentally not look that different, but you would have, you would have a greater proportion of time where a league was professionally run and was a bit more established and had fans engaged than at the moment where you have a month of ILT20 and 2 months of IPL, and the month of ILT20 is a complete mess. Because to be honest, I think that's the one that I feel like the ILT20 is where franchise cricket has properly jumped the shark. It's like it's complete. It's franchise cricket at its logical conclusion of, it doesn't matter that there's no one in the stadiums because we have a big
late stage franchise cricket.
Honestly, we have a massive broadcast deal that's long term, and that sustains the league. We have IPL owners and Americans who are throwing cash at it. It's fine. It literally doesn't matter that no one comes or that no one is interested in who wins. And it feels like that is the shocker. And then obviously you have the fact that most franchise leagues to some extent are sustained by their local players, and you have some regulars in the UAE national team who aren't getting into their starting lineup at RT20 because there are only 2 local players per team. There's a maximum of 9 overseas players per team, which every single person who's involved in RT20 who's not from the UAE spins as we need to have 2 local players in the team rather than having it as framing it the other way around. So, I honestly am at the point where I think, personally, I would much rather that there was no ILT20 and there was a 3-month IPL window than the status quo. And I think that's a thing that people are probably going to begin to wrestle with over the next little while, because I don't know, at some point, what do the Ambanis think of it? Do they really think that this is better than a 3-month IPL? Surely they should start logically. They should be pushing the BCCI and saying, rather than us having this league that no one takes seriously in January, February, why don't we just expand the IPL?
They're probably thinking, can we get a league in Saudi Arabia? But
true.
But the truth is that, and I've been saying this for years, that when we didn't merge different markets together, so when New Zealand, Australia didn't have a combined league, and when Sri Lanka and Pakistan and Bangladesh didn't have a combined league, we were kind of always heading here because everyone was so convinced they were going to make all this money from these leagues. And you're just like, yeah, I think you're missing the crucial 1.3 billion people that you need, and the love of, and the finances in those countries that you need. And so everyone's trying to copy a model that doesn't make sense. Like if you actually, I don't know, I'm trying to think of it. If people had tried to copy the CPL model, right, of like, it would make more sense, because you'd have a bunch of leagues that kind of exist and make sense. They're not like some of these new leagues that are just for betting. They're not like some of these things that are just for owners to own things. There's a reason for it to exist, but it's also, it doesn't have high hopes for itself. It doesn't think it's about to get, the best players in the world consistently, but instead everyone's gone for, this huge thing. Let's have a look at something else here. You talk about, like, I think there's a reason why the owners at the moment are happy with this, because it does mean that they're more likely to get bigger name players to play for them, right? The more bigger name players that are on the treadmill between all these leagues very much helps. But how long before some of these owners like, I think it was Nicholas Pooran who was playing for 2 different ownership groups in the IPL in the tournament. How long before that it's like, well, wait a minute, if he's only doing this 100% for the money, and he's actually now playing for our opposition team. How long before the owners start to go, this isn't worth it, we're not doing that? Because I can't imagine, I think you and I both probably agree now, it's basically an owner-driven world, franchise cricket. They're the ones who are going to have to change. And if I was an owner, I think I would be a little bit pissed off that, the whole Trent Bolt thing. I know it didn't quite happen for Trent Bolt, but it might happen for Jofra Archer, who eventually players are going to be signed to one IPL franchise and play around the world. That might happen quicker just to stop some of this nonsense.
Yeah, and actually, I think there are 2 interesting and slightly different examples to talk about there, and one of them is Bolt, because Bolt is now in a position where he is under contract and has been for, I think this is his 3rd season with Rajasthan, the IPL. Rajasthan Royals obviously own Barbados Royals and the CPL, and they also own Pole Royals and SA20. And Bolt is effectively playing for Rajasthan for the IPL, and then playing for Mumbai expansion teams in everything else. So he's playing for Mumbai Indians New York, he's playing for Mumbai Indians Emirates. I think it's just those two for now, but no doubt if they bought another team, he would play for them. From Rajasthan's point of view, how does that work? From Mumbai's point of view, presumably they want to win the competitions that they're in, but also, surely they would ideally have him in the IPL as well, having previously had him in the IPL for a while, and he was a title winner with them and all that. So that's a difficult one to get your head around. And then the other strange one is there's a couple of IPL teams in Gujarat and RCB who have very much focused on the Indian market and haven't bought teams around the world as yet. Gujarat are obviously owned by private equity, CVC Capital, and RCB, I think they're called Diageo, who are sort of very much an Indian business who are focused on the Indian market. They bought a WPL team, but that's their only other team apart from the men's IPL. So Gujarat, one of their players is David Miller, and David Miller plays for all of the Rajasthan Royals expansion teams. But then in the IPL, he plays against Rajasthan Royals, and in 2022 played against them in the final, which Gujarat won. So again, from Rajasthan's point of view, how does that make sense? So they're effectively, helping Miller for 9 months of the year, and then he's scoring runs against them in the final. And from Gujarat's point of view, are they not thinking, maybe we should be tapping into this? Should we be buying other teams? Should we have some kind of exclusivity clause with Miller where we say, please stop playing for our opponents for the rest of the year? Or are they, seeing it as an opportunity to basically free ride on one of their opponents being in a position where they want to sort of fund him for however many months of the year outside of what Cricket South Africa do? So I think both of those examples are sort of show how confusing it is at the moment. And Pooran is the other good one in that, he played for Durban Super Giants against MI Cape Town one week and then captained MI Emirates the next week. Doesn't make any sense.
A lot of people complain that I'm not a former cricketer and so that I don't really know the game. Well, you know what they can't claim? That I don't know desks. I've been using desks for years. I'm a collector of desks, old and new, and I'm sitting on a new one right now. I'm the Don Bradman of sitting at desks. So when I tell you that the E7 Pro next generation height adjustable desk from FlexiSpot is legit, this is like Michael Jordan talking to you about sneakers. This desk holds 160 kilograms. It is as stable as anything I've ever seen, and it has under desk cable management. But really, the main skill here is that this desk rises and falls at the push of a button, and it moves super quick. And it has so many settings that remember your favorite heights. It really does it all. And I could not recommend the E7 Pro from FlexiSpot anymore, even though I am currently sitting on one of FlexiSpot's BS12 Pro multifunctional, adjustable, upgraded fabric, ergonomic chairs. My butt and computer have never been happier than when using one of FlexiSpot's products. So get over to their page right now for big savings. It's crazy. It's just so weird. And I remember I reckon about once every couple of weeks, I get asked the question, should we bring the Champions League back? I was like, how would you play the Champions League at this point? Because it was hard enough before when you had a couple of players who played multiple teams. And it's like now everyone does. Like Sam Billings could qualify for every team, I'm pretty sure, like in a Champions League, right? Like, I mean, some of these guys are just absolutely ridiculous. And just on the player stuff as well, we'll just get back to that. You came up with something. If the players declare themselves available for the knockout stages, they should be rendered unavailable for any other domestic cricket until the day after the final. And then you also talked about the Bravo rule in the Blast. And so the Bravo rule is very, very interesting in that essentially it says you can't just bring a player in for the final. Right, you can't do. I think I might have talked about this on TalkSport when we were talking about it, but you can't do what Monty Burns did in The Simpsons when like the team has done really, really well, and then at the last minute you bring in all the
Darryl
Strawberry and the guy with the bad haircut, Kenny Griffith Jr. and all those guys. So that rule again, when you look at something like that, the reason that you can do that in the Blast is because Blast fans were getting annoyed, and Blast fans exist, which is a really important thing. the love of those teams exists. Blast fans were getting really annoyed that teams were just like dropping in Dan Christian. Well, I don't think he ever did it. I know he did it for the CPL, but dropping in players like Dan Christian or Dwayne Bravo at the last minute into their teams for the finals. The issue there, I think, is to go back. Let's forget the owners for a minute. It actually, if I'm running a league and like Rashid Khan could come in for one game and we're going to get X amount of social interaction for this. We're going to get the Cricinfo article, maybe, TalkSport and BBC are going to talk about it. It'll be on all the Indian news channels. Oh, so-and-so is flying in and he's on a private jet and they're going to, remember the David Warner helicopter story? We've seen that in these leagues like 100 times. Not to mention also funnier ones in the early days of the Blast, like when they couldn't find Shahid Afridi before a game. But all these sort of stories actually do help. So your rule makes sense, but it needs an adult to enforce it. And it also needs a fan group who are invested enough to get upset at this. And the problem with these leagues is it's actually hard for some of these leagues to get that sort of fan group because, as you said before, it's like international cricket captain or football manager. People are just going, yoink, yoink, yoink. So even if you like a team, it's going to be very different than being an Essex fan who's like, spent your dad was an Essex fan and your grandmother was an Essex fan and you were given an Essex vest when you were a kid and all this sort of stuff. We are talking about people who are supporting teams that didn't exist 2, 5, 10 years ago. And so there's no fan interaction to be able to get that done. The people who run the league just want more clicks, right? Sometimes views as well, but the clicks are almost as important now. So when you come up with a good idea like that, it's like, that's fine, but who would be the person to implement it? And that comes back to the point that no one is really running these leagues. They are completely deregulated. And a lot of them don't even exist for any logical reasons.
Yeah. I'll be interested to see what happens with the Big Bash, actually, particularly next year, I think. This year you had I actually thought the Big Bash was the best it's been for 5 odd years, I think, maybe even more than that, probably since they initially expanded it this year. But again, you had this strange situation around the finals time where I think Paul Walter, who is a journeyman English pro, was the only overseas player playing in the Big Bash final, because the Sixers had James Vince, who then left for ILT20, and the Heat had Munro and Billings, who went for ILT20, and they had Walter as well. But it's a really strange situation where I feel like the Big Bash clubs, for the majority of them, they're now thinking in terms of, or a lot of them, because of the fact that they're not really having to think in eyeballs in the same way that some are, and because of the fact that the league is established, there are some actual Big Bash fans. And also there's now quite a lot of alignment with the state teams in a lot of cases. If you look at the players who went in the Big Bash draft this year and in the last 2 years, really, a lot of the time they are slightly lesser names who generally the availability has been better because teams have cottoned on to the fact that actually signing Dre Russ for 4 games is not really in their best interest if what they care about is winning. And at least, probably half the teams at least do genuinely seem to care more about winning than engagement. Which is an important place for the league to have got to. But then, as you say, a lot of other leagues haven't got to that point, and they need someone to say, sorry, guys, we actually just can't do this. This doesn't make sense. But we're not at that point. In terms of who would actually implement it, I suppose the biggest governance change that actually turned out to be nothing in the last couple of years in terms of leagues was that I think Johnny Gray first spoke about this in about 2017 or 2018, but eventually the ICC voted on it last year and voted it through, but not properly, which was having a maximum of 4 overseas players in any given league. And then they had a slight tweak where they said that associate players could count as local players, which I don't mind too much personally. But they said that this will only apply to leagues that are applying for sanctions from now.
Yeah.
At which point you have the ILT20 with 9 overseas and Major League with 6 overseas in the starting 11. So, and they said, we'll try and sort them out at some point, but that's not real. That's not happening.
No,
the ILT20
and those
are not
two
getting
leagues,
pressure put on.
Yeah, those 2 leagues, if you, let's say in 20 years' time, who knows where it will be, but those 2 leagues as it stands at the moment would be useless if you had the normal conditions, right? Like there would be no point watching it. You would be watching like you'd be watching Aaron Finch go up against like some kid from a park. Like, so again, if you think about it, like if you really want cricket to work in America, that would be the worst thing for you to do.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's what I mean. That rule's been, I think Johnny Graves started talking about that with the T20X. Do you remember that? No, XT20.
Yeah.
What was it called?
The sort of precursor for ILT20. I think it was T20X.
And there was the Emirates Premier League at one stage as well.
Yeah.
And that was the whole thing. Is the idea was, we can just have this in Dubai and Indians will still watch it because it's a good time zone, but we'll only have international players. And then all the boards went, wait a minute. You can't do that. And so, it started to change a little bit. Look, just on the whole thing, players and their agents are now incredibly powerful, obviously. They want to make money from all this. But I think you and I both know that the issue here is that a lot of this could just fall apart because they're not actually doing the basics. None of these leagues are doing the basics right because it's not how they're being run. Boards want to keep hold of their players, but they also want to keep them happy, but they also want to run their own leagues, right? And they also want their own leagues to be successful. And so you have this kind of, and that's before we even get to the owners that we talked about before. We'll talk about them in a moment. But there is this kind of competing thing of, at the same time, you want to keep your players happy. You want to keep them on contract, but then you want to control what that contract is. But then you want them to be available for your league. And then the minute your league comes along, if you're let's say you're England, you're the 100, you want to be able to ship these players in, right? From, you want to be able to do a deal with Major League Cricket where there's no overlap, so you can have that. Or if there is an overlap, you can still get your players in for a little bit of time. The problem is that is untenable when you have the BPL, the Big Bash, the PSL, the SA20, the IL, all on top of each other. And there's no way to disentangle that by the look of it. It's literally going to be either leagues deciding to be secondary leagues, which is what the Big Bash has done, if we're being honest. It's what the BPL did until very, very recently. Is the only way to fix that. And even then, if the SA20 and the IL20 are just banging up against each other, I don't see how that fixes itself anyway.
Yeah, and the other particularly interesting one is that you can already see this being even worse next winter, I think, or next English winter, so 24-25 around the same time, because the Champions Trophy is due to start in, I think, the second or third week of February 2025, which obviously squeezes the window. ILT20 have sort of already publicly not ruled out and floated the idea of moving the tournament to sort of November time, which would squeeze potentially the start of the Big Bash. Might cause some kind of, I don't know what the T10 would do in that instance.
Oh my God, I forgot that existed until
just
now.
I know. And then I think the other thing that the Champions Trophy is going to do is it's going to push the PSL back, and I think that's already quite accepted and built in within Pakistan cricket that the PSL is probably going to go up against the IPL next year, at least for a couple of weeks, which will be, I think, the first time that's happened. And I don't know whether that's already had an effect in terms of the PSL's pulling power, because it does really seem to have struggled on overseas players this year. I think that might just be the fact that it doesn't pay quite as well as the other leagues that are now on in this rough time of year. But it might also be because people know that if they commit to PSL in 2025, they're going to effectively rule themselves out of IPL for some of it at least. So I don't think it's going to get any better. In terms of the changes, I mean, I do think that we've probably passed the point of no return in a lot of this. So we do need a point where you need chief execs and chairman to get together at the ICC and actually come up with some kind of solution. I don't have any huge faith that will happen.
That's because you're a cricket reporter who has followed the sport.
I read Richard Thompson, the ECB's chair, was talking about this in a Sunday Times article the other day, and was saying, basically as a result of that cap at 4 overseas players, he didn't think that the Saudis would launch their own league and instead would probably buy into other ones. But he was describing, I got the quote up, he said, with regards to, he said particularly MRC, they're basically international tournaments masquerading as domestic competitions. We've capped it significantly in terms of the damage it does. We're close to saturation point as regards domestic franchise cricket. I don't think there's interest to invest in or create another breakaway competition. Personally,
that's just not true.
I think there's almost certainly, I think in terms of if you speak to people involved in the business side of it, I don't think there's any shortage of random business guys who are saying, yeah, of course I'll have a team. And I think a lot of the current owners are saying, why can't we expand further? Why can't we, effectively diversify our business by having income streams in 5 different countries rather than the current 2 or 3?
Well, also, when he says that, has he been paying any attention to the veterans leagues?
Yeah, I mean, Legends Leagues is a whole different thing. But
are we up to the 4th or 5th major one? I think starts next week. I mean, they are coming also, just as fast.
And also, something that's happening there is that you quite often are seeing players sort of formalize their retirement in a way that they didn't before, because that then makes them eligible for Legends Leagues. But then you also, I noticed one recently, which honestly blew my mind, because I thought that I know he's a personal favourite of yours, but Ben Dunk, I thought he was long gone. And he ended up, based on the fact that he did well for the India Capitals in a Legends League at the end of last year, signed for the Dubai Capitals in the ILT20, which obviously clashes with the Big Bash. But Ben Dunk has been old news in the Big Bash for the last 3, 4, 5, 6 seasons.
He was retired.
And he's a retired player. He's now getting game time alongside David Warner and Jake Fraser McGurk in the ILT20, which is just...
It's crazy. I know. Yeah. I saw that too. Because someone sent me a message going, "Did you see the Dunk innings?" And I sent back and go, "I don't watch veterans leagues." They were like, "No, he's in there." And I was like, "What? How does this happen?" No, it's crazy. So the thing is that there needs to be a conversation that probably happened 5 years ago. For being honest, it's a bit like climate control at this point, right? It's like a great conversation to have 5 years ago would have been everyone getting together, but. Let's say my idea of like joining up a bunch of these leagues now can no longer happen, which probably looks like is the case, right? There has to be a conversation where you bring in all the interested parties. The problem is that even if that happens, actually getting a situation that pleases everyone, I think would almost be impossible from here. And so the IPL, if I was running the IPL, I would be laughing, right? Because all these other leagues are just eating themselves up. And as you know, not turning a profit, not going anywhere particularly. And it's not that they're ever in competition, but there isn't a unified voice on the other side of the IPL going, actually, if we do this, this, and this, we can have a great league in this time of the year and everything else. And so you are getting to a situation where even if I was an IPL owner, I'd be like, why am I buying teams in all these leagues anymore? Like so you had a line in your piece about the irony would not be lost on anyone if private investors ended up being the parties lobbying for regulation. I actually think the best chance now is not the boards getting together, because the boards are almost irrelevant, let's be honest. The best chance is probably all the owners getting together, all the major owners who own multiple teams, and just getting together and go, okay, this is what we want to do. This is what you want to do. This is what they want to do. Can we come up with a system that works for everyone where we make bunches and bunches of money? But there's actually a reason for us to own a team in South Africa. There's a reason for us to have this league here or whatever else. I think that's probably the best way of doing it, and almost forming above the ICC, the OCC, the Owners Cricket Council, right, where they look at that, because even with the BCCI, the owners the Ambani family is very close to being the most powerful entity we have ever had in cricket, if they are not already there, right? And they are not the only ones, right? There are many other important groups coming through. Truth is, having a bunch of board members who don't actually always, like Richard Thompson said that, and my first thing was, didn't you just do a deal with Major League Cricket to make sure that you didn't overlap with them? Why are you slagging them off? Like, anyway, but I would think that's where it's probably going to be at its best, where the owners all get together and go, okay, this is what we want. And then you might end up with BPL and Big Bash as secondary competitions that only appeal to local markets. So you don't need, who was it? Paul Walters? Is that his name?
Paul Walters, yeah.
I've forgotten his name because he until recently he didn't exist as a human. But those could be secondary markets where you could still have professionals, but you just don't need the biggest names playing in those leagues anymore. That is kind of how I see it working, but I don't know if the owners are ready for that kind of conversation yet.
Yeah, and to be honest, I largely agree that I think that will probably be the way it goes. And I think my biggest fear along that, I think that could work in a lot of ways. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if pretty soon we're talking about an expanded IPL, and we're talking about potentially part of the season being played overseas or in Dubai or in Saudi or wherever it is. I think my fear with all of this is that we all know that India is the biggest market in the game. We all know that Indian franchises are the ones that matter. The question in a lot of this is, where does this leave Pakistan? Because, and you could do an entirely different podcast on that if you want to, but it's a situation where a lot of these leagues, we see a handful of Pakistan players involved in the ILT20, but the vast majority of them are at Desert Vipers, who are American-owned. I think Imad was with Abu Dhabi Knight Riders this year. But generally, Pakistan players do not have the same opportunities in leagues where the majority of ownership groups are IPL-related or Indian. And I think that is a troubling situation where you could effectively have Pakistani players who are, shadow banned from more leagues than is currently the case, because that is a fundamental issue that has persisted for a long period of time, and I don't think it's one that anyone is really going to address, because that's bigger than franchise owners, that's bigger than sport. But I fear that cricket will leave itself open to even more problems of that sort if we get to a point where, we're getting to that point already, but when IPL franchise owners further embed the power that they already have.
Yeah. I remember the first time I worked for a team where I was just told we can't pick Pakistani players. And I was like, but if we did that and no one else did, we would win. So there is that side of it as well. But yeah, look, I mean, you're right. I think eventually Pakistan, the PSL probably becomes it's probably the other league that will be multiple months, right? Which is again why I think it should team up with Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and do it properly. But you're right. I mean, that's the thing. It's it is so messy. There is no real answer to any of this. And I suppose you could go back through almost any time in cricket history and make that exact same statement. When no one is in charge, things just kind of bump around and happen, right? What do you think? You said before, do you think next year it will be worse because of the Champions Trophy and everything else? Do you see anyone actually finding a method to be able to fix this in, let's say, the next 3 to 5 years? Or do you think that we'll have 9 more Legends Leagues? I don't know, the Namibia Premier League and everything else. Like, will it get worse or better, I suppose, in 5 years' time, based on what you see at the moment?
I expect it to get worse, if truth be told. I appreciate that I've become a gnarled old man at the ripe old age of 25, but I feel like
it's hard to see it getting better, right?
It's hard to not be cynical about this. I mean, another good example. This doesn't necessarily answer your question directly, but another good example of where we're at was straight after the SA20 last year. Owen Morgan announced his retirement from all cricket, which I assumed was going to mean he wouldn't play for a while. And then, having commentated on the first, I think, 4 Ashes tests, he missed the 5th test at the Oval because he was playing in the Zim Afro T10, which is a T10 owned spin-off in Zimbabwe. You don't have to.
We all know about that, the Zim Afro T10. People are on the streets. I walk down the streets, people just asking me about it.
And I heard, I'm pretty sure it was a matter of public record that the first game of that tournament was delayed because of floodlight failure, because no one had put any coins in the meter on the first game. And yet they were paying enough that they effectively, they had a better offer to Owen Morgan, a retired player playing in an active players league, than Sky, who are the biggest broadcaster in England and have a broadcast deal that sustains English cricket. If that's not a little bit of a sign of the times, then I find it difficult to think that in 5 years' time we'll have returned to bilateral cricket being the be-all and end-all, and tri-series where teams pick their best players and the odd player dipping their toe into the franchise circuit. I think even franchise cricket being run smartly, being run well. But I think we've probably missed the boat, and I think it's probably going to get worse before it gets better.
That's why I bring in the young people to give me so much optimism and everything else. Matt Roller, thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks, Jarrod.
Thanks to the kind folks at FlexiSpot for looking after my office and my butt by sending me their E7 Pro desk that save your favorite desk heights at a touch of a button. You don't have to crank anything. This thing just finds the height that you like and you can work. And their BS12 pro chair that supports my posterior while I'm recording, well, this ad and all my shows. If you need great desks, especially ones that change heights, or the best quality chairs, head on over to FlexiSpot today.